final day together. It is beautiful.
With Ghost of Tsushima's conclusion, the story of Jin Sakai reached an emotional, inspiring, yet deliberately unsatisfying ending. That lingering sense of dissatisfaction came not from any kind of poor storytelling, but from uncertainty. The unresolved fate between Jin and his uncle Lord Shimada ultimately left us wondering, did Jin choose mercy or honor? Did he kill his uncle, or was he spared? And beyond that moment, how did the legend of the ghost really continue? By the end of the game, whispers of myth had already begun to shape Jin's legacy. Stories began to spread all across Tsushima, claiming the ghost stood 10 feet tall. Others said he was building a private army to strike the Mongols directly. The people, desperate and inspired, rallied to him. Farmers, fishermen, and merchants traveled from every corner of the island, bringing whatever goods they could, offerings of gratitude and faith in the one man who dared fight back. The ghost had become more than Jin. He was vengeance given a form. Yet that same legend would turn against him. Tsushima's unity under the ghost, coupled with the Mongols adopting his own weaponized poison against the island, painted Jin as a threat greater than invaders themselves. To the shogunate, he was no longer a hero. He was an uncontrollable symbol, a revolutionary, one to be outlawed and hunted. This conflict between duty and defiance, family and faith, honor and survival, is what made a sequel to Jin's story such an exciting prospect. It begged two haunting questions. How would the rest of Japan react to the ghost's legend? Would he be feared, worshipped, or both? And for someone as humble as Jin appeared to be, that evolution, seeing how his myth spread beyond Tsushima's shores, would have been extremely powerful. It could reveal how the people of 13th century, bound by samurai ideals, responded to a warrior who rejected them to protect the innocent. One who actually renounced being a samurai, making it all the more powerful. And then there was the question of Lord Shimada. Did Clan Shimada endure? Was he tasked with hunting Jin down in shame and silence, or disgraced entirely for being defeated by the very person he called his nephew? With Ghost of Yotei shifting away from Jin and focusing instead on Atsu's story, which is set over 300 years later on a distant island, many of those lingering questions remain unanswered. And truthfully, they probably always will. The fate of Jin and his uncle, the true aftermath of his rebellion, all of it has been left to time, memory, and speculation. Yet fragments of Jin's story still find their way into Yotei, woven subtly, beautifully into this world itself. It's not a direct continuation or even a clean resolution, but rather a reflection. The way Sucker Punch chooses to handle Jin's legacy becomes a lesson in its own right, how myths evolve, how truths fade, and how a person's story can be shaped or reshaped by those who come after him. It reminds us that when history is built on legend, on rumors, half-truths, and distant admiration, it can grow into something entirely different from the person who actually lived it.
Eyes that saw my pain. A fate neither of us want. Will death redeem us?
Now, I want to break this down simply. The more obvious references to Jin, what they mean, and then dig a little deeper, because the way Jin is remembered in Ghost of Yotei actually ties into a much older and more layered part of the series lore than most people probably realize. So, let's start with the beginning, with Clan Sakai, Jin's family. Jin was the last bearer of that name, the final living member of his bloodline. By the end of Ghost of Tsushima, Lord Shimada makes it clear the shogun had stripped Jin of his estate and dissolved the clan entirely. Officially, Clan Sakai no longer existed. Now, depending on how the shogunate recorded Jin's fate, whether he was listed as the ghost, a disgraced former samurai, or, out of quiet respect for Lord Shimada, marked him down as killed in battle during the Mongol invasion, the impact of the Sakai legacy would have varied dramatically. If he was branded a traitor, the name would forever be tainted. If declared dead, it might have been allowed to fade quietly into some kind of myth. But even before Jin's rebellion, that legacy was very complicated. His father, Kazumasa Sakai, wasn't exactly remembered fondly beyond Tsushima's shores. He was known as the Butcher of Iki, a title earned when he led an invasion to bring the lawless island of pirates and smugglers under shogunate control. To the people of Iki, it wasn't liberation, it was an occupation, and they would bear this entire event a name that reflected that properly. They would come to call it the Sakai invasion. The people of Iki never forgot what the samurai did to their island. Their hatred ran deep, and by the time of the Mongol invasion, that resentment still lingered. So when Jin, son of the so-called Butcher of Iki, returned 15 years later, his decision to abandon the samurai code and embrace the ghost persona gave him a rare opportunity to work alongside the very people his father once fought to subjugate. At first, they didn't trust him. Why would they? But the more they saw of Jin, the way he moved, fought, and listened, the more they realized he wasn't like the others. Despite his posture and speech, he wasn't a samurai anymore. He was an oddity, something in between, an outcast of both worlds. And it was through that the people of Iki began to lower their guard. They saw him not as a soldier of the shogun, but as a man fighting for something far more than human. Jin's time on Iki might seem like a tangent in this discussion, but it's worth highlighting because it reshaped how the Sakai name was remembered, before and after the rise of the ghost. Before, it represented power, conquest, and obedience to the shogunate. One feared and even tainted on account of his father's atrocities on the island. After, it became a symbol of rebellion, compassion, and defiance against the very system that birthed it. And then, at the center of all of this incredible transformation for Jin was Yuna, Jin's closest ally and the person who helped forge the ghost. She was of course the one that taught him how to listen, how to adapt, how to fight without honor if it meant saving lives. Yuna pushed Jin to break free from the samurai's rigid code, showing him that survival required more than tradition. Without her influence, the ghost wouldn't have existed, at least not in the form that inspired an entire island. For the majority of the story in Ghost of Tsushima, Yuna's primary goal was to seek transport to the main island of Japan, to get far away from this war with the Mongols that she considered wasn't even her war, as her priorities lied with her and her brother Taka. She wanted the two of them to just escape, retire, live quiet, peaceful lives. Of course, that's not how things turned out. Taka was killed, sacrificing himself in his commitment to the ghost, desperate to prove he could be more than just a blacksmith. And his death had a very deep impact on multiple things. For Yuna, it left a hollow space where purpose used to be. With her brother gone, she no longer knew what came next. For Jin, it left a mark far deeper than just words or even a loss of a very close companion. Every piece of the ghost's identity, the mask, the armor, the symbol, the hook they used, all meshed together into the symbol that would terrify his enemies. And all of that was crafted by Taka's hands. His work became immortal, woven into the legend itself. In that way, Taka never truly left. He remained with Jin in spirit, living on through every act of defiance, every life the ghost saved, or everyone he cut down. But for both Jin and Yuna, Tsushima had become nothing but loss, a land of scars and painful memories. Jin's focus turned entirely toward the Mongols, toward the endless war with them, and so their paths quietly diverged. The ghost carried Taka's legacy forward, while Yuna wandered into a world that no longer felt like home. And that's how they went their separate ways. Yuna's relationship to Jin created yet another massive question mark. However, unlike Shimura, there is a conclusion to this, to a point. In the mythic tale of the Stormblade within Ghost of Yotei, fragments of Jin's life, both the outlaw he became and the man he really was, resurfaced through relics and whispered legend. The tale recounts how after completing his mission against the Mongols on Tsushima, and later on Iki Island, Jin eventually vanished. Gone for a significant amount of time, no one really knows where he went, with the rumors, and hence confirmation by Atsu, that he eventually landed here on the island of Ezo, far to the north of Tsushima and Iki. Now, a small footnote here, the reason why Ezo would have made an immense amount of sense for Jin was because Ezo itself was not under shogunate control. It was a territory still vastly considered a wild frontier of sorts, so he would be able to retire in relative obscurity. There would be no one to hunt him, there would be no one to know who he was or the feats that he did on the islands hundreds of miles away. And over time, his name would fade from record entirely. Storytellers' words no longer speak of Jin Sakai, but of a nameless warrior, a samurai who defied the Mongols and died in silence. The shogunate erased him from history, outlawing the story so that only the honorable victories of the samurai remained. Officially, the empire triumphed, and it was the samurai that stopped the Mongols. Any whispers of the ghost or any single man was strictly forbidden. Of course, during this tale, many pieces of Jin still linger. You can find his sword, his mask, his family flute, the burned adoption papers from Lord Shimada, a badly conditioned Sakai helmet. These artifacts tell a haunting story that even in death, Jin carried the weight of his past. The condition of his helmet hints at a final stand, at some glorious, intense battle that we unfortunately never got to witness. A battle that may have perfectly concluded his story and made him personally at peace with the idea of retiring this life of fighting and just moving on. This tale is where the ghost met his end and the man was finally buried beneath his own legend. And notice how one particular piece I didn't talk about, that is a knife that can be found in his home here on Ezo. On the knife, there's the name Yuna carved into it. Now, because of this piece, people have speculated that Jin and Yuna landed on Ezo together. There's strong indications that Jin had some kind of romantic feelings towards Yuna during Ghost of Tsushima, so naturally some people would be happy with the idea that the two of them retired together in peace. I'm gonna be honest with you though, I never perceived it as such, for a number of my own reasons. For one, with the conclusion of Ghost of Tsushima, it seemed very clear to Yuna that she was moving on completely. Even when Jin tried to make it clear that Yuna still had him, she distanced herself by saying that he's a ghost. No one has him. He belongs to everybody. This story that takes place on the island of Iki is after the conclusion of the main story of Ghost of Tsushima, and during that DLC, Yuna is not a part of it. There's no continuation, there's no return to the mainland or return to the island of Tsushima where Jin and Yuna speak again. There is a vision that Jin has where Yuna basically saves him, but that's more of an insight into his personal feelings and thoughts on Yuna, rather than a real tangible impact that she made on that story. And then there's the haiku that you find in Ghost of Yotei. Listen to it.
Someone wrote a haiku. Looks like it was written ages ago. Alone, far from home. Old friends, never forgotten. Cherished sacrifice. Whoever wrote this was in pain, but proud.
It is entirely plausible that Yuna did die here on Ezo. However, there isn't any other grave besides Jin's here. And this haiku is one that, as Atsu says, is one that hides behind pain. Jin is lonely and far from home, and he can never return. So finding this knife, I think, makes it incredibly sadder on what happened to Jin. I don't find this as anything else besides Jin carving what would have been his closest friend, his closest companion's name into a knife that he long missed as a form of remembrance. And the fact that it was carved on a dagger, I think also signifies a sense of homage. She was basically the one that taught him and reinforced the idea that it was okay to attack from the shadows, to strike without someone seen, to fight without honor. She was in many ways the manufacturer of not only the image, but Jin's new fighting style. And in the end, she was his personal confidant. The only remaining major outlier when it comes to this knife, I would say, is its design. It's not Jin's personal dagger. In fact, if you look quite closely at the knife and at various moments throughout the story of Ghost of Tsushima where Yuna pulls out her own dagger, it does appear to either be the same blade or one fashioned to look very similar to it, as yet another way to pay homage to her. I don't recall Yuna ever handing her dagger over to Jin. Maybe that was a part of her tales, and at the very end she might have gifted to him. I don't remember how her entire saga of tales quite ended, but I don't remember her ever gifting it to him. Regardless, I think when you take this as a whole, it's not a conclusion of them ending up together, but more so Jin admitting that he's alone. He sacrificed everything, and as painful as it is, he's proud of the outcome.
And now, I'm alone.
You're not alone. You have me.
A ghost. You belong to everyone.
Ezo itself was still a wild frontier when Jin arrived, and it would remain that way well into the events of Ghost of Yotei. By 1603, the newly established shogunate had just began preparing to extend its rule north through Clan Matsumai. That expansion was exactly what Lord Saito and his occupying forces sought to resist. And it's in this volatile climate that it makes perfect sense a portion of Saito's men would cling to the legend of a man who once defied the shogunate and its most sacred institution, samurai. To them, this nameless warrior was the first of their kind, the first shinobi, who had used a mysterious poison known as Wolfsbane to single-handedly turn the tide of the Mongol invasion centuries earlier. The story had survived in fragments, whispered across generations of hidden clans, but none really embraced it quite like the Kitsune and his unit, the Ninetales. They believed that by mastering Wolfsbane, they would be given the edge needed to overthrow their oppressors. In their eyes, this poison wasn't dishonorable, it was actually divine. A gift from the first shadow who had once struck fear into both Mongol and samurai enemies alike. It's yet another one of those tragic echoes in Jin's legacy though, the worst method he ever employed, spiraling far beyond his control, shaping the very future of warfare in ways he had never intended or expected. The people of Ezo already viewed shinobi as ghosts, spiritual foxes who fought unseen, and with the poison in hand, their legend only grew much darker. But perhaps the greatest remnant of Jin's influence wasn't the poison at all, but his sword. The Ninetales' reverence for the first shinobi would eventually drive them to seek out the Stormblade, the ancestral katana of Clan Sakai. Yet it wasn't the weapon's lineage that made it infamous, it was the art bound to it, a technique known as the Dance of Wrath. A series of strikes so precise and unrelenting, it could cut through any enemy's defenses. This to me is the most fascinating thread in all of Jin's legacy within Yotei, because for those who remember, the Dance of Wrath didn't originate with Clan Sakai at all. It came from Clan Yarikawa, once renowned for producing the finest swordsmen in all of Tsushima. The technique had been passed down through generations until Lord Takeyosa Yarikawa, its most skilled master, led his infamous rebellion against Lord Shimada. The Dance of Wrath would come to claim Shimada's father and brothers, and the uprising was only crushed through the combined strength of clans Shimada, Sakai, and additional reinforcements from the mainland. In death, Tokiyasa was believed to have avenged his people through the spirit of Yarikawa, who continued to answer offerings from his vengeful followers. This, of course, is its own mythic tale in Ghost of Tsushima. Jin would later face this spirit, and would come to find out that this was none other than a woman, perhaps a disgraced samurai of Clan Yarikawa, led adrift after the rebellion's collapse. Jin would come to defeat her, inheriting the technique in the process, and from that moment forward, the Dance of Wrath became part of his legend. One more weapon, one more burden, carried by the man who would one day become the Ghost. It's just interesting to me that that is the one element that survived, the way that it did, because out of Jin's many successful techniques, the fact that he's known for the Dance of Wrath, a tool that he basically got from the mortal enemies of Clan Shimada, it adds more depth and complexity to Jin, his background, and of course the various pieces that make up the symbol of the Ghost. And it also adds an immense amounts of lore behind the Ghost series as a whole. If you want to learn more on the history of Clan Yarikawa's rebellion, feel free to check that video out, as I've covered it in depth before. For the rest of you, what does this say for the legend of the Ghost? Is it enough to bring Jin's story to a satisfying enough conclusion, or do you still hope to see more?